Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. It is my pleasure to host you today on this webinar, Colombia, the Solar Future, a Land of Opportunities. My name is Leoncio Montemayor. I'm a project manager at Solarplaza, and it is with great pleasure that we have Diego Mesa, Deputy Minister of Energy for the government of Colombia, talking us about the opportunities that lie in Colombia for solar and renewable energies. So without further ado, let's just get started. Yes, I think you already see the agenda. So basically, it's quite a simple agenda. I will start with a basic introduction from Solarplaza, and then we'll move on to Diego's presentation, to the Vice Minister's presentation, and then we'll be hosting an open Q&A with everyone. So make sure to have some questions for the end. So let's move on to the next slide. So we're doing this webinar as a prelude to one of our conferences, the Solar Future Colombia, which will happen the 6th and 7th of November in Bogota, where you're going to learn, connect, and step into Colombia's promising solar market. We're looking at 120 international finance and project development executives. We're gonna talk a lot about different topics such as PPAs and the financing and the subsidies, auctions, and a lot of more topics. We're gonna use our Solarplaza app to make networking easier. And this is the only conference with both national and international participants dedicated solely to Colombia's solar sector. For all of you who don't know about us, about Solarplaza, our mission is to positively impact the world by accelerating the sustainable energy transition. We do this by organizing high-level events around the world, as you can see on the map over here. We're based in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. We were established 15 years ago. And we have organized more than, actually more than 110 events now. In 30 plus countries. So we have a huge network of 60,000 solar PV professionals. Some practical notes. If you have any type of issues with the audio or the video, you can use the chat box on the dock, on the control dock of the software, and Marco over here will help you. If you have any questions for the webinar, please use the questions box. We will be keeping track of all these questions, and then we can tackle them at the end after the Vice Minister's presentation. You can submit your questions anytime during the webinar, so just so that you don't have to wait until the end. And then the presentation slides are available in the handout section. So just on the control dock, you can see a section called handouts, and you can directly download the slides. And we are recording this webinar, and we will be posting it tomorrow. Without further ado, let's introduce our speaker of today. Is Diego Mesa Puyo. He is Colombia's Deputy Minister of Energy. He is an economist with more than 15 years of experience. In these 15 years of experience, he has advised governments and private sector clients on financial issues and public policy for the energy and for the energy industry. He has worked at the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund, where he led and participated in many missions in more than 20 countries on fiscal issues for the mining and petroleum sectors. Previously, he worked in the consulting and deals practice of PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC in Canada. He holds an MA in economics from McGill University and earned the CFA designation, Chartered Financial Analyst, in 2012. So Diego, please, we're gonna pass the control to you, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Leoncio, for the introduction. So let's get into this right away. So the presentation I have this morning is about what we call the energy transformation in Colombia. And I'd like to talk about, what is the government of Colombia doing to make sure that we incorporate renewables into the power generation matrix, and, how we are developing power auctions that are specifically designed for this type of technologies, but also how we are promoting distributed energy resources, and other type of business models for solar and other renewables that hasn't been present in Colombia power market. So I'll start with a very quick international context as a background for what Colombia is doing right now. And here, what I want to point out is that when we look at what has happened over the last 10 years on the renewables space. Yes?
Sorry, we don't see the slides.
Sorry.
Yeah, there it is. Perfect. Yeah,
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Leoncio.
Thanks.
So I want to start with the international background to give context to why Colombia is now moving so quickly into the renewable space. And what happened is that when we look at what happened over the last 10 years on renewables, we see that most of the growth has come from either solar, wind, or biomass technologies. So over the last 10 years, these technologies have been growing at an annual average rate of 16%, which means that basically every 4.5 years, the world has been doubling installed capacity of renewables. Obviously, this has triggered significant investment worldwide. The numbers that we have from IRENA is about close to $3 billion, over $3,000 billion on investments over the last 10 years. And then when we look at what countries have done to incorporate this type of technologies, this sources of power, most of them have used power auctions, specifically designed for renewable energy. And up to 2018, there were about 189 countries worldwide using power auctions, long-term power auctions. And then obviously also this also has a significant effect on jobs generation. Only in 2018, more than 11 million jobs were created by these industries. And when we look at the map, we see that the spread of wind and solar energy generation is a trend that is basically in every corner of the globe. So here, I'm just showing which countries have at least 10% of their power matrix comprised of either wind, solar, or a combination of both. And here, the story here is that in these two graphs, we see significant investment worldwide, but Colombia was completely absent. Colombia wasn't participating in any of this, and there are a number of reasons why. But this is part of the background. Then when we look at what are the economic drivers, because and that's one of the things that we've been arguing in Colombia, the drivers for this growth, especially in recent years, has to do with the price of these technologies. And what we see is that for example, solar has decreased significantly in price. I'm showing here a graph that has the minimum price of power auctions on average worldwide by year. And we see that solar went down from about $120 per megawatt hour in 2010 to about $20 per megawatt hour in 2018. So it's a significant decrease in the price of solar technology or photovoltaic technology. The same or a similar story has happened with wind, even though the graph doesn't make justice to the decline. But what we can see is that in 2010, the minimum average price in these auctions worldwide was close to $51 per megawatt hour, and it went down almost to half of it to $28 per megawatt hour. And in the meantime, what we see is the hydropower has been relatively stable, with some actually increases in price over time. And then to complement this, we also look at what has happened with the price of batteries. Of course, because the storage component of these technologies is also important to make sure that users can handle the intermittent nature of these technologies. And when we look at batteries, we also see a significant decline in prices. Between 2010 and 2018, the price of batteries went down from close to $1,160 per kilowatt hour to below 180. So 10 times lower than what it was, almost 10 times lower than what it was in 2010. And the forecast is for continuous decrease in this type of technologies in price. And then finally, to also to try to square all this, we also look at other segments of other business models that are being developed, and we see that with electric mobility, especially in Latin America, there's been a growing appetite over the last 3-4 years, with significant increases in many Latin American countries that are recording increases of close to 180% over the last 2 years. So this, there's obviously an economic driver behind this. In Colombia, for example, one of the myths was that these technologies, especially solar and wind, were not competitive, that they couldn't compete with hydro or with thermal generation in Colombia. And I think that myth has now disappeared, and people are realizing now that these technologies are very competitive. In fact, they may be even cheaper than what we have in Colombia. So when we came in in 2018 as a new government, we look at what was the composition of our power matrix, and what we can say is that in 2018 the Colombia power generation matrix was composed of more than 2/3 hydropower, hydro dams, and the other third was mostly thermal, which includes coal, natural gas, and other liquids. And even though this reliance on hydro makes the Colombian matrix very clean, in fact, according to the World Economic Forum, is the 6th cleanest in the world. There are other exposures or vulnerabilities that worry us. So what we say is that because of the geographic position of Colombia, we're very exposed. We're one of the 20 most exposed countries to climate change, and climate change for Colombia in the area of power generation means El Niño phenomenon, which is when we have the droughts during the year, and the level of the dams go down, and our power system gets really stressed. I think the last critical event was in 2015, 2016, when we almost have like a blockage of a blackout of the sector, and then we see also in addition to the economic benefits of the renewables, we also see a big opportunity to complement the matrix to make the power matrix much more resilient. So then we started looking at what's the potential in Colombia, and here I'm showing a map that on the left has is the solar map of Colombia. On the right hand side we have the wind map, and on the solar side we can see that most of the Colombian territory has solar radiation that is higher than the global average. And specifically, if we look at the north part of the country, on the Atlantic basin, that part has 60% more radiation than what the global average is. So huge potential that has been untapped and explored. And on wind is basically the same. We also see that especially on the north part, the wind blows at twice the rate of the world average. So starting to put all the pieces together of the puzzle, we see in Colombia that there's a need to get renewables. The renewables have become really competitive, and then that we have huge potential both on solar and wind. Yet, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, Colombia was completely absent from this global trend of energy transformation, where the renewables, the non-conventional renewables, were having a significant role. So we said that after 1 year of government, that our energy transformation has already begun, and the reason for this is that we structure an energy policy that is based on 3 main pillars. And I think in every one of these pillars, we see non-conventional renewables coming up. So the first one has to do with efficiency. And when I talk about efficiency from the power sector, I'm thinking, efficient price formation, more competition, new agents coming into the market, and more options for users, for consumers of energy. Then the second pillar that we have is what we call reliability and coverage. And here, the system in Colombia has been quite reliable. We have different mechanisms to make sure that we have the energy, even in those situations of stress that I mentioned before when we have El Nino. But so we need to continue to have a very secure and stable system. And then on the coverage side, we still have a significant gap in the percentage of the population or the number of people in Colombia that doesn't have access to electricity. And here, we have very remote areas that are not connected to the grid, and then renewables, specifically solar systems, become a very good option to help us, close that gap in electricity coverage. So now I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a minute. And then obviously on the sustainability part, we want to make sure that we continue to have a clean matrix. We also, as a country, have acquired a number of commitments, international commitments, for example, under the Sustainable Development Goals, COP21. So, we still need to continue this trend that we have a power matrix that is sustainable from an environmental point of view. And of course, renewables here also play a critical role. So what initiative or what policy measures have we implemented so far? And here I think this is very important for new investors to pay attention to. So the first one, we passed a Finance Act in December 2018, and the main goal of that act was to introduce incentives for capital-intensive industries such as energy. So the first measure that we introduced in the Finance Act was to lower the corporate income tax rate, which is quite high by international standards. It was at 33%. So we are gradually reducing that rate from 33% to 30% over the next 4 years. And the idea is to make our tax system more competitive. Probably some of you know that Colombia is in the process of accession to the OECD. In the OECD, I think the average corporate income tax rate is probably 25%. So 33% was very far behind. So going down to 30, making it a little bit more competitive, but hopefully, probably the trend is to continue to decline after 2022. But this is, what we're proposing for this government. The second one, the second incentive, which I think is the most powerful one, is that we realized that the VAT, the value-added tax, was a big hurdle for investment. And the reason is because this is a tax that is supposed to be levied on consumption. This should be a tax on consumption, but what was happening in Colombia was that it became a tax on investment. So the measure is that all the VAT that any investor pays on the acquisition of fixed capital is going to be 100% creditable against corporate income tax. So in other words, what we're doing is that we're eliminating VAT on capital assets, on fixed capital, on fixed assets, and that payment of VAT on those assets just becomes an advance payment of corporate income tax. Okay, we did the same. We applied the same measure for other two small taxes that are also a little bit of a hurdle on investment in Colombia. One is what we call the industry and commerce tax, which is a small levy, and the second one is the financial transaction taxes. So for those two taxes in 2019 and 2020, it will be 50% creditable against corporate income tax, and from 2021 onwards, it's going to be 100% creditable against corporate income tax. And I stress here, for those of you that don't have a tax background, there's a big difference between making a tax deductible for corporate income tax and creditable. And in these two cases, is creditable, which means that if you pay, $10 of VAT, then you deduct directly $10 from your corporate income tax bill. So it's a pretty powerful incentive. And the second and the fourth one, the last one, is basically to eliminate, it's to eliminate red tape. We used to have what we call alternative environmental diagnostic for projects, for renewable projects, and we agreed with the environmental authority to eliminate this process for projects that are greater than 10 megawatts of installed capacity of renewables. So this is one less, process that investors have to go through when they're putting together a renewable project in Colombia. Then, after the finance law that we passed in December, then we have what we call the National Development Plan. And for those of you who are not familiar with, the Colombian policy world, every 4 years, the new government passes this National Development Plan, which is a law. This is a law of the Republic, and in this law, you include, all your main policies for every sector of the country. And here we have specific incentives for developing the non-conventional renewables industry. So the first one, which is quite important, is that we have a target, which we didn't have before, that between 8 and 10% of all the energy generated in Colombia has to come from renewable sources. So we're putting a specific target in the law, and all the purchasers or the people that buy energy in Colombia has to comply with. So of their portfolio of energy purchases, between 8 to 10% has to come from renewables, non-conventional renewables. Then we have a law in Colombia that maybe most of you are familiar with, which is Law 1715, which has a number of fiscal incentives for renewables. So we made some modifications to that law. The first one, which is very important, is that in that law, there is a 50% additional deduction for corporate income tax of all the investments in renewables. However, that incentive was only limited to 5 years. And when we came into office, we started talking to investors, and we realized very quickly that this incentive, because of the limitation of 5 years, was only good for existing companies, for incumbents. And the reason was obviously that a new project, a new investor, a new company was not able to generate a taxable income in 5 years or less. So they were not able to use this deduction. So we extended this incentive from 5 years to 15 years. And here the incentive is very simple. If you invest $100 on renewables, you were able to deduct from your corporate income tax purposes 150. So it's a 50% uplift on your investment. So now we've gone from 5 years to 15 years. And then the last one, the other important incentive that we made to the law 1715 was that law included an exemption of VAT for solar panels and other equipment for solar generation. However, that exemption was required a number of steps. You had to, if you were an investor, buying a solar panel, you had to certify what was the end use of that panel, which was absurd. So if you were not importing the panel yourself and you were buying from a wholesaler, basically you were not able to get the benefit for yourself. So obviously for small scale power generation, this benefit wasn't working at all, especially for people that want to have panels in their houses or in small businesses or in their country houses. They were paying the full VAT on this equipment. So we made this extension automatic. So now people that are buying this equipment, they don't have to certify anything, because once the equipment is imported into Colombia, it gets exempted from VAT automatically. So we're trying to, this is an incentive to try to, make sure that everyone in Colombia that wants to get a panel, a solar panel, or solar equipment is able to get it without having to pay VAT. And we're already seeing the numbers. We see now a big increase in the number of panels that are being imported into Colombia. So after we've made these changes in the Finance Act and in the development plan, what has happened? So I talked at the beginning about how the power matrix is 2/3 hydropower and 1/3 thermal. Well, we did what we call the reliability charge auction in February, and for the first time in the history of the Colombian energy sector, we had 8 projects from non-conventional renewables, which means that that matrix now went from having basically 0% participation of renewables to having 6%. We got 6 wind projects in La Guajira, and we have 2 solar projects in Cesar, which is another department in the north of Colombia. And when we started back in August, the president had a goal. We wanted to go from less than 50 megawatts of installed capacity of non-conventional renewables to 1,500 megawatts. With this auction, we basically we just we met that goal, because between the 8 projects we have about 1,400 megawatts of installed capacity. So we said, okay, we need to be a little bit more aggressive on our goals. We now have 1,400. So what we want to do is, by 2022, after we finish our auctions, we want to left behind at least between 12 to 15% of the matrix, of the power matrix, with non-conventional renewables. So we have a big challenge ahead, and but we think we have the potential, and we have all the incentives in place to get to this point. So where are these projects located? This is very consistent with the solar and wind maps that I showed you before. So we had 6 projects in La Guajira, which is the northern tip of Colombia, and we have 2 solar projects in Cesar, which is that other department that is showing up in the map. And then finally, moving to the auction program. So I mentioned before that most countries around the world, they've used auctions, power auctions, to incorporate renewables. So Colombia, I think, is not going to be the exception. We already have these 8 projects that came in that auction, in that reliability charge auction that we did in February. But now we're doing an auction in September and October that is exclusively dedicated to non-conventional renewables. And as most of you know, we also did an auction in February for renewables that didn't work out. There are many reasons why that auction didn't work out, even though the demand and the supply curve actually did meet. The main reason for not having a successful auction was that the regulator in Colombia had very strict competition criteria, and 2 out of 3 of those criteria were not met. So after that auction, we've been talking to most of the agents in Colombia, both generators and distributors and companies or users that buy energy from these generators, and we made significant changes to the product that is being auctioned, and also the mechanism to assign energy. So here I want to slow down a little bit and talk about this second renewable energy auction, and what are the main changes that we made, and why we think this auction will be very successful. So the first thing to mention is that in the past, Colombia was working under this concept of technology neutrality. We basically meant that any type of technology could participate in the auctions, and because of that, we had to have some participation criteria that basically consisted of a ranking mechanism in which you awarded points to the different projects. But the auction was open to any type of technology, thermal or hydropower could participate. So in this auction, we said, we have now a specific goal that is in the law. This is 8 to 10% of the power generated has to come from non-renewables. So he said, let's get rid of those participation conditions and let's make the auction exclusively for non-conventional renewables. So that's a big change. The second change that we did is that before we had a threshold or a limit, and the auction was only for projects that were 10 megawatts of installed capacity or greater. So we lowered this to 5 megawatts because we realized there were a number of small projects in Colombia that wanted to participate, and they couldn't do it. So now, we moved to a lower threshold, which we think, it's going to open up for more projects to come into the auction. Then moving on to the product, here is the biggest change of all. So the Colombian market was used to what we call financial contracts rather than physical contracts. And in the previous auction, we decided to go with a physical contract in which, the buyer committed to buy the energy whenever it was generated. Now we're moving to a financial contract in which the seller of the energy commits to deliver a quantity of energy regardless of, whether they're generating or not. And I think, this is a good change, because one of the reasons why also the last auction was not very successful was because there was big uncertainty around when that energy was going to be received. So when we talked to the electricity companies that didn't participate in the auction last time, they alleged that they were not comfortable with this physical contract that we introduced. So now we have the financial contract. Also thinking about the generators, we decided to go into time blocks. So we have 3 time blocks. So if you have a solar project, you can choose only to make bids for the middle block, which starts between 7 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, which is when you have most of the solar radiation in Colombia. But if you have a wind project, you can offer in the 3 blocks, or you could also come with a portfolio, and you can offer in the 3 blocks, and you can choose to do solar in the second block, and maybe a small hydro dam in the other blocks. The other big change that we did after talking with most of the developers and generators was to expand on the contract time. So we went from 12 years, from a period of 12 years to 15 years to make sure that these contracts are much more bankable. And I think this is going to be a significant change. And then finally, moving to how the energy gets awarded, we came up with the help of some experts from Chile and from Colombia with an optimization model, basically an algorithm that is going to maximize the allocation of energy, but will also minimize the price. And here, the important thing to note is that because it's an auction in which both sellers and buyers will make price bids. If you're a buyer, you can rest assured that you won't get energy for a price that is higher than whatever you offer. And if you're a seller, also you won't get into a contract in which is gonna pay a price that is lower than whatever your bid was. So with these changes, I mean, we've seen significant interest and enthusiasm for the second renewable auction, and we're expecting much more participation in the first. And then finally, I mentioned that another reason why the auction was not successful was because this competition criteria set up by the regulator. We also talked to the regulator, and we relaxed those criteria, basically thinking in the amount of energy that's going to be transacted. So we're also okay with the changes there, and we think this auction will be successful. Then finally, to complete this energy transformation initiative, we're also looking at more profound changes in the power sector, and for this, we've conformed a mission of experts, both international and national experts, and we're going to be looking at 5 different areas within the power sector. So the first one, we want to look in the market structure in Colombia, competition, participation, and we're going to get recommendations from these experts on how to make additional changes to make sure that the sector is more open to new businesses and new players. The second area of this transformation mission is going to be looking at what is the role of natural gas in this energy transformation. We think in Colombia, given that we have high potential of gas in the medium to long term, the natural gas could play a very important role as a backup energy source for power generation. The third area is looking at new business models. So we're going to be looking at decentralization, digitalization, and how to have mechanisms that can allow the demand to be more active. In Colombia, the demand on the power sector has been very passive. This is a market that is dominated, by the supply side, by the generators. But with all the new technology that that's now available, we want to see prosumers. We want to see, users making smarter decisions about the energy they consume and so forth. The fourth pillar is, or the fourth area is looking at subsidies. We spend a lot of money in electricity subsidies in Colombia. We want to make sure that we rationalize that, and we also are looking at closing those gaps that I was talking about before. And obviously, after looking at all these four areas, the fifth has to do with doing a comprehensive review of the institutional and regulatory framework for the power sector. So this mission is already working. They're gonna be drafting some position papers with clear recommendations on each of these areas, and we expect to have the final papers towards the end of the year, around November or December. And the idea is to start to have a roadmap to make policy changes and regulatory changes over the next 3 years to be able to implement all these recommendations. And then to close, I want to talk about closing these social gaps that I mentioned before. So here we're talking in this webinar, we've been talking about new sources of energy. So we've been talking about wind, solar. We're talking about new business models. We're talking about digitalization. How we can put all this technology innovation for the benefit of consumers. So it sounds all very modern, which is all good. But when we look at the challenge that Colombia still has on coverage, on making sure that 100% of the population has access to electricity, we realize that we still have a debt with the Colombian population. And what I can tell you is that even though we have 97% of coverage of people with access to electricity, that 3% that is remaining makes up 500,000 households, which translates into approximately 2 million Colombians, which, in the ministry, we think that is unacceptable. Colombia is a middle-income country, is entering the OECD, is looking at these other, opportunities, but we still have 2 million Colombians without access to electricity. And in this space, we think that renewables, and in particular, solar systems, whether are microgrids or individual solutions, are going to be the answer to how we can close this gap. In this 4 years, our plan is to bring electricity to 100,000 households with public funds. We expect the private sector to add another 80,000 households. But even then, we're going to have at least 320,000 households without electricity. And our goal for universalization is 2030, which we think is too far ahead. So we're calling on the private sector to also come up with solutions to help us close this gap. So Leoncio, I think this is all. I hope this has been useful, and obviously I'll be around to answer questions from participants. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Vice Minister. This was a very enlightening and comprehensive presentation. I'm actually personally very excited for the results of the second auction and the rest of how non-conventional renewables will start gaining hold in Colombia. We actually have quite some questions from the audience, and this is just another reminder for people to send in their questions. So let's just get started on some of these questions. One person from the audience is asking, what is the regulation on non-utility solar energy generation companies. So for those generation companies that are not like a utility.
Okay, so but the question is, it's a bit broad. So when the person
Yes,
asks
it is.
about regulation, it means, well, so in order to be able to deliver energy to other users, you need to be a utility company, right? However, if you generate for your own company, we do have regulation that allows you to sell the energy that you don't use to the grid. So and that can be done at a large scale or at a small scale. But if you're connected to the grid, you can sell the excess energy that you don't consume. That's regulated by
Okay,
the
okay.
by the CREG. Even if you want the number of the regulation, that's CREG CREG 030 is the number of the regulation that regulates sale of energy to the grid.
Okay, okay. I think that settles it. There's a couple of people. I think there's two questions asking about storage. So, what are the possibilities for storage for implementing large-scale batteries in Colombia? Where do you see that?
Uh, so I think we have significant opportunities on that space. I mean, obviously one is to complement the generation from these intermittent sources, but also we have in some parts of Colombia a lot of congestion in the grid, and I think that could be solved in part with storage. This is a very timely question because we are in the process of issuing regulation for storage. And if you go to the regulator website, you can even comment on the regulation that's being proposed. Obviously, this lengthy regulation because the first time that we're regulating energy storage in Colombia.
Okay.
But yeah, but this is something that is it's in the works. But the resolution to regulate storage is now it's being published for consultation, for public
Okay.
consultation, so people can go to the CREG and take a look at it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's pretty good. And when is the timeline on this regulation? Like, is it gonna be by the end of this year when it's fully implemented?
Yeah, so basically what we usually do is that we consult the public for about 30 business days, and then we answer all the questions. So we issue kind of like a matrix with answers to all the questions, and then probably 2 months after that, we issue the final regulation, unless there are significant questions or structural questions. So yeah, so I think by the end of the year, we'll have that regulation published.
Okay. Okay, that sounds good. Um, yeah. Also, like we have a lot of questions to them out, or grouping asking about the structure. So what is the plan of the government, or what's the roadmap to update the interconnection infrastructure for 10, 12%?
Okay, so that's yeah. So very good question. Right now we're focusing on bringing a transmission line from the north, from La Guajira to the center of the country. That transmission line is being built, is going according to plan, and that will connect most of the projects that are registered with the energy planning unit right now. That's being done by Grupo de Energía de Bogotá, and I think it will enter into operation. The COD is in November 2022, I think. Sorry, November 2021. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, because I mean the Guajira, as you were saying, it's like a diamond, right?
Exactly.
So you really need to do these interconnections
Exactly. And here, I
to
mean,
maximize. Yep.
and one thing that we need to be, cautious of, we do have some issues with communities. So I think
Okay.
communities, we need to consult communities for transmission lines or projects, and this is something that I think is not only unique to Colombia, but dealing with communities, especially with indigenous communities, has become a bit of a bottleneck. So we're working very hard with the Minister of Interior to make sure that this process of consulting the communities is much more expedite. So we're allocating resources. in the National Development Plan, we have an article in which we're creating basically a fund, a trust, in which, in the same way as companies pay the environmental authority to issue the licenses to do all the studies, companies could also, will also pay to consult the communities. And we think that those resources, which, for the companies are not going to be significant, for the Ministry of Interior are going to make a big difference, so they can have the resources in place to make sure that we expedite those consultation process.
Yeah. Understood. A couple of people as well are asking about the situation regarding the PPAs. So one question is, what is the current situation for commercial and industrial PPAs or commercial and industrial generation? And another question, just to group them together, is, will there be a government guarantee for the PPAs, or how do you ensure bankability on the producer side?
Okay, so so the first question which relates to industrial producers, I think that maybe the person is thinking about what we call non-regulated users. So they can come to the power auction as long as they buy energy from a commercial company that distributes energy. That's fine. What exists right now outside of this mechanism is that there are bilateral contracts. So we know there are a lot of big companies that they enter into bilateral PPAs, and that's fine. We're also trying to regulate that bilateral market to make sure that it's more competitive than what it is right now. So that's another resolution that's out for public consultation, but we're trying to bring closer that bilateral market to the competitive mechanism that we're setting up with the auction. The second one about government guarantees, we do not have government guarantees. There are a number of guarantees, financial guarantees, that have to be placed by both generators or producers and buyers of energy. The first one is, once you make your first offer, or you show up your interest, you have to put a guarantee it's not very big, and then you have to put a financial guarantee for the construction of the plants if you're a generator, and you also have to put also a guarantee to make sure that you will comply with the purchase of energy if you're buying energy. So in this front, I should have mentioned before, we reviewed the guarantees that were implemented last time, the last auction, and we decided to lower some of them. So I think those guarantees that the companies had to put up front have been significantly lower. We maintained the guarantees for payment and for delivery of energy, because those were right, and we actually hire a pretty sophisticated financial firm to help us with the guarantees. But the good news is that the guarantees that have to be put up front have been significantly lowered. I think they went down from like 50% of the energy that you were going to be offering or buying to 5%.
Oh, okay. Thanks for answering. We have a little bit more questions and 7 more minutes approx. But let's get through them. One person from the audience is asking, even though long-term auctions have been a great tool for investment and development in many countries around the world, like Mexico, the grid, the transmission and distribution infrastructures have been under a lot of stress, and in some areas topped out. So how is the Colombian government working to make sure that there's grid stability and to strengthen it proportional to the auctions and the renewable energy participants?
Yes, so it's a great question, and we are aware of that. However, our analysis is that with the amount of energy that will be incorporated on a gradual manner, we don't have a big worry. I mean, obviously, we need to have the transmission lines from the Guajira. We have to make some reinforcement of other points, obviously in the grid, which we're working on. And beyond renewables, we had a big issue in Colombia over last year, which is what we call restrictions, which is the congestion in the grid that's causing additional costs to the system. And we've been working significantly over the last 11 months, and we've been able to reduce the cost of that congestion, which we call restrictions in Colombia. and we basically, you know, I think we've managed to reduce that by 40% just by making reinforcements in different points of the grid, and you know, making transmission lines viable. So we're aware of that problem. We don't want to, you know, fall into the same mistakes that were made in other countries. But what we think right now is that, you know, what's going to enter into this new auction and what enter in the reliability charge auction, we're fine. Obviously, if as we grow to that 12-15%, you know, we probably need to make other adjustments to the grid going forward. But you know, we're aware of that, and okay. Also we also issue regulation for ancillary services, you know, to complement the incorporation of renewables as well.
Yeah, of course. Okay, I see. And you mentioned that you know, part of the plans were on the digitalization of the grid. You know, what's the plan here? Is like, what's, for example, the smart meter penetration in Colombia? Is there a plan to you know, start putting smart meters in the homes? Or
yeah.
How are you ensuring the digitalization?
Yes, great question. We're starting from a low base, and obviously, you know, the first building block for this is obviously having smart metering. So the ministry already issued a resolution to introduce smart metering. Our goal is to have by 2030 at least 75% of, you know, all the homes with smart meters. So we've seen some cities, obviously, you know, mostly capitals, in which the electricity companies are doing this proactively already, even before this resolution came out. So we think we're going to have, you know, probably close to 50% or so in the next 4 or 5 years. And obviously, you know, that's kind of like a simple average, but we think probably that number is going to be significantly higher in cities. Probably not as high in rural areas.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. There's a question for you. It's a little bit long, so bear with me. So it says self-generation projects above 0.1 megawatts are a big opportunity, you know, for the development of PV in Colombia. But right now, there's the backup charge, cargo de respaldo, is a no-go for some projects, with this fee not being set in a reasonable way for PV projects. Where the projects which maybe suddenly require backup from the grid in just 12 known hours of the day and not in full nominal capacity. So this is something which is not considered in the calculation set as per CREG's resolution 15 from 2018. Following? So right now the subject depends on goodwill and different interpretation of regulation from the grid operator. Is the government or the regulator checking into this?
So I must have to you know, I'm taking notes of this one, and if you can send it to me.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Because you know, I don't have the specific answer for this one. I thought the question was more related to, you know, participation of those small projects into the auction, and I think what he's referring, or what she's referring to, with the cargo por confiabilidad, is that you know, in order to get into the auction, for example, you have to agree to be to participate in the central dispatch, and that means that you know, those small projects, if they receive the cargo, they have to give it back, just like, you know, the way the VAT works. Right now, some of the incentives for small projects that they don't go to the central dispatch is that they don't have to refund the cargo por confiabilidad. So there's a financial incentive for that. But anyway, I think the question may be a little bit more technical than my interpretation. Yeah. So I'll make notes, but I'll take a look at this after the webinar.
Okay, perfect. I'll send it to you. A question. There's a couple of questions about the people with regarding energy access. Yes. So is there any incentive to electrify the unelectrified?
Yes. So actually, that's a very timely question. So there are a couple of things that I should mention there that I didn't mention before. First one is because, you know, I said we want to see entrepreneurs and the private sector, and hopefully also research institutions, universities, proposing new schemes. We launched a contest in which we partner with the Ministry of Commerce and we will be, handing out a financial prize to whoever brings a solution that is sustainable to go to these remote zones. So I'm gonna ask Monica, she probably is connected, to put on the screen the website. We're extending the period. This is gonna be open maybe for the next 2-3 weeks to register to participate in this contest, and then obviously there is a phase in which the proposals are gonna be received. And the idea is that we find someone or a company, a startup or a university that propose a new business model to go to the remote zones that are not connected to the grid, and we will fund implementation for 100 households. And if the solution works out, we're ready to massify and fund significant expansion of that product. So this is an opportunity for entrepreneurs to participate, for universities. I've been talking about this in a lot of universities over the last 2 weeks. And then the second thing is with the regulation that we have right now, we're having an issue for example, paying subsidies in those remote areas for solar systems. But today we will be publishing a new resolution in which we're setting up a new subsidy for photovoltaic solutions. So probably this will be published later on the minister's website. So with this additional subsidy for the operation and maintenance costs of these solutions, I think we're going to close that financial gap for these projects to be viable from an economic point of view in the zones that are not connected to the grid. Because they work fine with diesel right now, but we're having an issue with solar systems.
Okay, perfect. I think some people are asking for the URL or the new resolution, but maybe we can follow up on that on an email, so we can figure this out later. Yeah. I think we're reaching the final question. What prices is the government expecting, or what are your expectations in terms of prices for the auctions? Because you were showing some prices. I mean, we've seen in Brazil, in Mexico, prices around $20, $25 per megawatt hour. Yes. Do you think this is also feasible in Colombia?
So I think, I don't think we're going to get that low. So remember that chart was showing the minimum price in auctions in every year, right? So it was not the average, but it was the minimum. In Colombia, I think, the price right now on average, I think it ranges from maybe $45 to $65 per megawatt hour. I do think we'll be able to see lower prices than that. I've seen some, private consultants publish analysis over the last week or so, and they forecast maybe a reduction of $10 or so compared to what the prices we're seeing in the market these days. What I can tell you though is in the auction that we did in February, the prices that were offered obviously were confidential. We were not allowed to release those prices, but I saw all the prices that were offered, and this was probably the most frustrating thing for me at the time. And the prices that were offered were significantly lower than the prices that were being transacted at the time on the bilateral market and obviously on the spot market. So I hope to see prices that are similar or even lower than what we saw in February.
Yes. Hopefully. Vice Minister, I think
as small suggestion. So I've seen that Monica has sent us the link for this contest that I just mentioned. So I don't know if you can maybe put it on the the screen so people can access it. That'll be good.
We'll send a message. It's like a text message to everyone.
Okay, perfect.
There's still some pending questions, but we don't have the time to go through all of them. Maybe we'll find a way to get them answered. But yeah, I think we're a little bit over the time. So Vice Minister, really thanks a lot for taking the time for the presentations and for the Q&A. It was a very good presentation, and you know, without further comments, I'd like to thank you, and hope you have a nice day. And thanks everyone who joined this webinar today as well.
Sure. Thank you very much, Leoncio. It was a pleasure to be here with you and everyone else that is in the webinar. And thank you very much for the questions. And you know, we look forward to seeing more people getting into this market in Colombia.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for those words. And with that, I would like to, of course, invite everyone to the Solar Future Colombia, where we'll be talking about these and many other topics regarding the future of solar in Colombia, the 6th of 7th of November in Bogota. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a nice day, and hope to see you soon.